Thank you for tuning in to Veterans Voices. I'm your host, Joshua Zebley, and my co-host is Buck Carmichael. Today, we honor Black History Month by reflecting on the incredible contributions of African American service members throughout U.S. military history. Later in the show, I'll be talking with Munford Point Marine Luther Hendricks. But first, I want to welcome Aubrey Matthews, Tuskegee Airman historian for Travis Air Force Base, and Toby Hubbard of Tuskegee Airman, Inc. to the show. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the
Thank
invitation.
you.
Of course. So let's set the stage here. We're talking about Tuskegee Airmen. For people that are not aware, Aubrey, can you tell us what is the Tuskegee Airmen?
The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African American pilots. Actually, they were the first American fighter pilots here in the Army Air Forces, and they made history. And I'll reflect on that a little bit later. And but they was in January 1941, the War Department announced the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron. So that's how it all got started. But they were a group of African American fighter pilots first.
Thank you, Aubrey.
Mm-hmm.
And Toby, just to kind of expand on that, how was it decided that African Americans would be trained as fighter pilots then?
Well, after World War I, many folk in the country, such as the NAACP, were concerned that Negroes, which was the vernacular of that day, were not involved with anything other than menial tasks, supply clerks, administrations, if you will. And there was a lot of protest saying that African Americans should be able to do something other than that. And the push continued. And when Teddy Roosevelt came into office, he was the one who made a decision. And it took a while to get it done, but he finally did it. And they did it as an experimental program. In other words, they didn't think it was going to work, but they had to do something to appease the public. So that's what caused them to give it a shot.
That's very interesting. There always has to be some champion, right? Or somebody that says like, we can do this. And it being pilots is like, I can't think of anything more that would be like, well, we're obviously going to take a risk here. Mm-hmm. They trained in the Tuskegee Institute, is that where?
Tuskegee, Alabama.
Tuskegee, Alabama.
And what's so amazing about this is that in 1925, the Army War College report titled The Use of Negro Manpower in War basically said that blacks were inferior, incapable of operating complex machinery. And basically they were saying, they're good for cooks, truck drivers, things like that, but not to operate complex aircraft. Well, eventually they made them equal. But they were very important. And I often hear Tuskegee Airmen referred to as the Tuskegee experiment to see what would happen, And they expected to fail, but history has shown otherwise.
So we know not all of them were pilots, right? Can you tell us about the other jobs that came with it? The navigators and different types?
Well, yes, you had navigators, which the 477th Bombardment Group flew the B-25s. You had navigators. You also had mechanics. You had air traffic controllers, parachute riggers, things like that. You have support people, and but they also a total of around about 16,000, and that included support people, pilots, but mainly the 332nd had the fighter pilots, and the 477 had the pilots. You had the navigators, and also mechanics.
There was something else that made
research going into the show.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Toby.
I was just going to add to that, many people don't quite focus on that point, but you just heard that there were some 16,000 that were involved with the program, but only about less than 1,000 were actual pilots. Mm-hmm. So that shows you that many of the people who were considered Tuskegee Airmen were not necessarily aviators. You've heard that some were navigators, bombardiers, but some of them were also nurses, some were corpsmen, and everything you need to keep planes in the sky. And some of them were even women. Some folks did not realize it, but many of the Tuskegee Airmen were women. And actually, some were even white pilots. And there's another story behind that, and I can share that with you when you're ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even some of the Tuskegee nurses, there were some who actually underwent flight training. I have pictures of those as well.
And sorry, Toby, did you say some of them were what kind of pilots?
Actually, some of the pilots that are considered Tuskegee Airmen were white aviators.
That
Now,
is
of course,
definitely something I did not know, and I think that most of our audience probably didn't know. That's because they were attached to the 332nd or one of the groups.
you hit it right on the head. For those of us familiar with the military, if you are assigned to a wing, for example, I was assigned to the 45th Space Wing. Everybody at that group was considered a member of the 45th Space Wing, but some were fighter pilots, some were helicopter pilots, some were navigators, some were cooks, some were administrators, whatever. But when the Tuskegee Airmen went into their training, someone had to train them. And the white pilots were the instructor pilots who trained them, some of them. And in fact, in our squadron, we had the privilege of having an instructor pilot who was a white pilot, but then another one of our pilots was one of his students at the same time. So they served together. But if you were part of that unit, you are considered a Tuskegee Airman. So they were part of the Tuskegee Airmen because they were assigned to that same unit. And ironically enough, the white pilots had to be bused onto the base because they couldn't live in the same barracks as the black pilots, even though they were training with them and working with them. But again, they had the same namesake, Tuskegee Airmen. And many of them don't necessarily share that information, but it's a fact, and I have some document to prove that. But unknown, some of the tidbits that some people may not know about.
Definitely.
Yes. And I had dinner in Orlando, Florida with two of the white Tuskegee Airmen pilots.
Wow. Yeah,
And so, yeah. And Noel Perry, she was the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen Training Unit as well.
that is definitely interesting.
Something I definitely didn't know about going into this, but I did some research myself, and just to get an idea of about how many pilots they estimated in World War II, and there's about 250,000 estimated. So to kind of put it in that 16,000 scope, what role did they have in World War II? What was their missions?
Okay, they had ground support. But, I wanted to say that, of the less than 1,000 pilots that, that were trained, only about maybe half that number went overseas. And when they went overseas, they were first assigned to North Africa. And they were assigned to ground support, which is Pantelleria Island is one example where they wanted to use that island as a stepping stone towards Italy. And the 99th was involved in that. And what the operation was going to consist of was the softening up Pantelleria Island. And then they were going to send in the ground troops in there to finish the job. Well, Tuskegee Airmen, they were tagged under Operation Corkscrew to participate in that bombing operation, softening up the island. And the bombing campaign was very intense. So when the Allies felt that it was time to send in the ground troops, they did, and the enemy was basically already standing there surrendering. And it was one of the first times in history that ground troops surrendered to air power.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, to add to that, prior to that particular operations, something took place in Ramatelli, Italy. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th Squadron particularly, were trained as pursuit pilots. And their job was to escort the bombers in. In order to soften up a target, we needed to get bombs on target. But in order to get the bombers in, you needed someone to escort the bombers. Otherwise, you'd lose the bombers en route. Quite frankly, the B-47 bombers' expectancy rate, life expansion, a life rate was about 43%. So we lost a lot of bombers. As a matter of fact, that's partly what gave the Tuskegee Airmen an opportunity to fly. Again, prior to the Tuskegee Airmen starting to fly in pursuit position, the bombers had a loss rate that was over 50%. So if the Army Air Corps needed to get at least if they needed to get 50 bombers on target, they would typically have to send in about 100 because they knew they would lose most of them. Well, the Tuskegee Airmen did something that had never been done before. When they went in on their first operation to escort bombers in, all the bombers returned home. I pause on that because that was unusual. As a matter of fact, if you were to have seen the movie Red Tails, you would have seen a clip that demonstrated that. When the Tuskegee Airmen took the bombers in, the bomber pilots had no idea who the Tuskegee Airmen were because fighter pilots or pursuit pilots fly out about 2 miles ahead of the bombers. So the pursuit pilots would take off and fly ahead of the bombers. So the bombers never saw them close enough to know who they were. They just knew that when they dropped the bombs, they all came back home because the pursuit pilots kept them safe. And upon the return, the commander of that bomber squadron was said that he wanted to make sure that the next time he went on a bombing mission, he wanted that same group of fighter pilots flying with him. Again, he didn't know who they were, but they brought all the bombers back home. And that's the lengthy story behind that. So that was the beginning of the Tuskegee Airmen's real heroic deeds. Did not lose a bomb on their first raid.
Yes, the Tuskegee Airmen really made their mark because before the Tuskegee Airmen were assigned bomber escort, bomber losses was very devastating. In one case, over 200 bombers were sent on a mission, and in that one particular mission, over 1/3 of the bombers were lost. That was just in that one particular mission. And eventually the Tuskegee Airmen came in and things began to change. And the Tuskegee Airmen made their mark, not with just the bomber crews, but also with the Germans. They were greatly respected by the Germans. They were known as the Black Birdmen. And when bomber crews saw how effective the Tuskegee Airmen were, eventually they were called the Red Tail Angels. And there was a very good reason, because I have spoken with some of the bomber crews, and some of them were close to tears when they were telling me that they thought that was going to be their last day on Earth, and Tuskegee Airmen saved the day, you know, Red Tail Angels. And then in regards to Red Tails, my civilian flying buddy, Lieutenant Colonel James T. Warren, worked with George Lucas on the movie Red Tails. You'll see his name in the credits.
Gentlemen, we're going to take a brief break, but when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. Stay with us.
Honestly, I'm not really sure why I'm calling. It's just...
I'm having nightmares.
My husband and I, we're just fighting a lot.
I can't get any sleep.
Things just keep getting worse, and it's starting to feel like I can't do this by myself anymore.
We could use some help figuring things out.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you called. Why don't you tell me more about what's going on? There's no wrong reason to reach out for crisis support. Whatever you're going through, the Veterans Crisis Line is here to help. Visit veteranscrisisline.net to learn more.
Welcome back to Veterans Voices. We were talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. So, gentlemen, it sounds like the Tuskegee Airmen are very good pilots, right? They had some good training, but what I was really thinking about, how was their equipment compared to the white pilots or the non-African American pilots? Did they get the best equipment? I think you both are laughing already, so so go ahead. We'll start with Toby.
Yes, the Tuskegee Airmen were given the leftover planes, the P-39, for example. I'm sorry, not the P-39, 47 and the P-40 Warhawk. They were heavy machinery. They were in good shape for the most part, but they were not the latest and greatest. And sadly, the Tuskegee Airmen were given the second-hand, if you will, aircraft. But they were able to show the world that it wasn't the aircraft that did it, it's the man behind the pilot, behind the wheels. And I'll give you a war story that, and I think that those of you who are aviators have heard about it can appreciate it. You heard earlier that from my colleague that the Germans feared the Tuskegee Airmen. Well, not in the beginning, because the Germans had turbine engines before we did. Our Tuskegee Airmen were flying propeller aircraft. So how does a propeller-driven aircraft outmaneuver, take down a turbine aircraft? Well, they did it because they understood avionics. They understood how to make some maneuvers that were unheard of at the time. For example, you got the German flying a jet engine that could fly twice as fast as a propeller, but they had to get within a certain distance before they could actually take out the propeller-driven aircraft. So the Tuskegee Airmen would watch the jet come behind them, And just as the jet was able to adjust prior to the jet releasing its ordnance or missiles, the Tuskegee Airman pilot would take a nosedive. What he was really doing in taking a nosedive, but he was going to do a circle. So as he was taking a nosedive, the jet just continued to fly straight ahead. It could not maneuver. So by the time the Tuskegee Airman was able to turn, he would be on the tail of the jet. And as soon as he straightened up, he could let his ordnance off and he would take out the jet because the jet was trying to turn, but he couldn't turn fast enough. And the Tuskegee Airman used that maneuver to outmaneuver, outfight, and win a battle with a jet that was faster, more armament, etc. So it was the brain power that did that.
Yeah, during one of the longest escort missions of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen escorted bombers on a long-range mission. They were supposed to have been relieved at some point, but the reliefs didn't show up. So the Tuskegee Airmen escorted the bombers all the way into Germany. And when they got there, they were met with the Me-262 jet fighters.
Yes.
And that was a mistake on the Germans' part because when they were confronted, the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 3 of the Me-262 jet fighters and damaged 5 others. That shows how skilled they were. And they were flying the P-51 Mustangs. And
yes, the Germans sent in their best, and they lost the fight.
Yeah, they lost the fight. Germans threw everything they could at them. They even had the Me-163 Bat rocket planes. And despite all their advanced aircraft, they came out on the bottom.
So it sounds like they're very tactically proficient.
They were very proficient.
What else do you think helped make them so successful?
Well, they had a mission, and they knew they had to be better. And they had something to prove. And I'm going to get into a little bit later that they proved that they were the best. But they had something to prove, and they proved it. And it was, talking to these bomber crew members, talking about how they were so effective at protecting their bombers, which is the reason why they were being requested, only the Red Tails being requested. Benjamin O. Davis, the commander, was so impressed that the bomber crews were requesting the Red Tails to escort their bombers that he went up there and renamed this aircraft by request.
One of the things that is important to note is that the escort pilot's job was to, of course, escort the bombers in and make sure that they were able to release the ordnances. But the escort pilots were told, do not leave your bombers uncovered. Oftentimes, and I know this may sound crazy, but many of the time, some of the white pilots were trying to become aces. So they wanted to take out as many planes as they could so that they could get their title. Well, often in an opportunity, in order for them to do that, they would leave the bombers uncovered and they would fly out chasing some sorties, chasing some MiGs, if you will, chasing some planes. And therefore you got bombers that were flying with no protection. And therefore they were easier targets. But the Tuskegee Airmen were told that if you did not bring the bombers back, don't you come back. So they stayed with the bombers through flak, whatever. And of course, when they were attacked, they peeled off and did their attack, but they came right back to make sure that they were with the bombers throughout the whole mission. And the bombers respected that. They sometimes, and they said this, and I've heard this from bomber pilots, and I'll get into that later. They said that sometimes they find themselves flying. They could not see their escorts because they were off chasing another plane, trying to become an ace. Therefore, the bombers were left uncovered, and another plane would come in and take out the bombers. So the Tuskegee Airmen stayed with their bombers to the end, but they peeled off as they needed to take out the other pilots from the German or whoever. And that's what caused them to be as popular and as good as they were. But again, as my colleague said, they had to prove that they could do the job. They were expected to fail, so they couldn't fail. They knew that they were fighting for not only themselves, but they were fighting 2 wars. They were fighting the German Nazis, but they were also fighting this thing called racism because they were told they were not capable of doing it. So they had to make sure that they did everything they could, and they did. If I could add just one other piece before I leave, when I said that I spoke to some bomber pilots, I live in a community in which we have quite a few retired military. I was at an event several years ago, and there were 100 retired individuals there, I was sitting at a table between two individuals who were of German descent. They fought on the German side. They were prisoners of war from the Allies. And they were telling me that they were treated as prisoners of war by our people better than the current Negro pilots were treated when they came over here. They found that odd. But I said, this is what we're talking about. But several of them shake my hand because they said that if it wasn't for what the Tuskegee Airmen did while they were escorting, they said their grandkids would be here today because some of their sons became pilots on the other side, and they made it through because the Tuskegee Airmen were escorting them. And finally, last year, we were at a Tuskegee Airmen Commemoration Day ceremony. And I shared this with Ray earlier that the state of Florida and a few others have been designated as a Tuskegee Airmen commemoration holiday. Let me say that again. The state of Florida has designated a holiday in honor of Tuskegee Airmen. And I was at an event last year, and I was with this young gentleman. He was probably about 35 years old. And after we finished talking, he came up to me, and several of his friends said, I want to just thank you because if it wasn't for the Tuskegee Airmen, I wouldn't be here. And I thought to myself, what does a 35-year-old guy mean by he wouldn't be here? And he pulled out a picture and showed a picture of his grandfather. He said his grandfather was a B-47 bomber pilot. And he flew during World War II. And he said that his grandfather told them that on several of those missions, they were afraid they wouldn't come back. But the Tuskegee Airmen were their escorts, and he believed that because the Tuskegee Airmen were their escort, he made it home safely. And therefore, the grandson say that if his grandfather had passed, he wouldn't be here. So he said, I'm glad the Tuskegee Airmen did what they did because he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for the Tuskegee Airmen.
And I heard the same thing. People come and say, if it wasn't for the Tuskegee Airmen, they would not be alive today. And sometimes in my speaking engagements, I say, people don't think about this, but how many people today, how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are alive today, thanks to the Tuskegee Airmen bringing back their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers safely back home to where they can begin their families. How many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, are alive today thanks to the Tuskegee Airmen?
Incredible.
Pretty incredible, like you said, but an incredible group of men. I mean, men, pilots, service members, I think all seem. Aubrey, you have a story, and I want to hear it. You said earlier, I'm going to tell you why in a couple minutes. You said you'll save it for later, so let's hear it. You're going to tell us why they're the best. I think that's what you said.
Okay. Reflecting back to 1925, when the Army said that the blacks are too inferior to fly complex aircraft. Well, fast forward to May 1949, Las Vegas. The Air Force had a gunnery meet, and I usually like to say it was a Top Gun gunnery meet. They wanted to find out who was the best of the best. So Air Force had squadrons come in. They met there in Las Vegas Air Force Base. It's now known as Nellis Air Force Base. So for several days, they had a competition. They did skip bombing, air-to-ground support, things like that. After several days of the competition, now, I want to set this straight. The Tuskegee Airmen were flying F-47s, but you'll see in some publications that said it was a P-47. But the P-47 was redesignated to F-47s. So it was F-47N models that the Tuskegee Airmen were competing against. And they were competing against better aircraft. The P-51s were redesignated to F-51s, and they were also flying against the F-82s, which looked like two P-51s joined at the wings. But the Tuskegee Airmen were flying a big F-47, which is much larger and heavier than the planes they were competing against. The other aircraft were, superior, but the skill of the Tuskegee Airmen was such that after a few days of competition, the Tuskegee Airmen won the trophy. They had proved, and this was the Air Force's first top gunnery meet in 1949. And despite flying outdated, heavier aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen were so skilled, they took the trophy. And afterward, that trophy went missing for many, many years. And my friend Zelly Orr eventually found it in the storage room, and it's on display now. But after the Tuskegee Airmen won that competition, that trophy went missing. But it gives you the skill. So now you reflect back what the Army said back in 1925 when they said they couldn't operate complex airplane, and then fast forward to where they actually became the first Top Gun winners of the military.
That is definitely an amazing story. You guys, I've learned so much. I didn't expect to learn that much, and I hope we can do this again, because I think there's more. You guys got a lot more in there. Today, I want to thank you guys again for your efforts to keep the memory of Tuskegee Airmen alive.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now we want to shift our focus to the first African Americans in the Marine Corps. Josh had the honor to sit down and talk with Montford Point Marine Luther Hendricks.
Yeah, it was really an honor talking to Mr. Luther Hendricks. The first thing I asked him was about his journey getting into the Marines. It was not that easy for him, as you will hear.
I will never be able to explain it. I just always wanted to be a Marine. Don't know where the idea came from. I guess I'm just an action man. Never figured I'd get to be action. And so when the war broke out, that was it. I went down to the recruiting station and said I'd like to join the Marines. And they said, we don't take color in the Marines. It's okay with me, so I went home. 2-3 months later, I came to Vallejo and went to work at Maryland as an electrician helper. And I worked from 1942 until August of 43. And I heard that they was taking Afro-Americans in the Marine Corps, so I went over to San Francisco and I joined up. They greeted me like a long-lost brother, said, we're so glad to have you. Come on in.
Boot camp is not easy for anyone, but especially not for the first African American Marines. Let's hear what he had to say about it.
I know I was on the train, not knowing where I was going, and I wound up in North Carolina. And I thought I was going to go to the big camp, Camp Lejeune. My instructor told me, no, you're not going over there, you're going over here. And all I could see over there was little grass huts. I call them grass huts, but they was tents. And said, that's where you're going to be. And they called it Montford Point. The wording that they used was not to our liking. Coons, uncle, boy, you people. But we're used to hearing that anyway, so we just shook it off and went on. And I guess in our mind we says, we're going to show these guys something. We're going to be good. We're not going to fail. It was a hard road to hoe, but boot camp was hard on anybody. But you have to learn to adapt yourself and make the best of everything. And we loved it. It was just like throwing us out in the river and telling us to swim. because we're used to hardships. And the DIs was strict, but they was good.
Luther told me about his time in service. He started out carrying food and supplies, but no weapons.
They had us carrying food, ammunition, up to the boys, and we got tired of being shot at and had nothing to shoot back at. And we said, so we was scared, no more ammunition, no more food. Give us guns, let us fight. And we bugged them so much, they said, okay, we're gonna give you the guns. And if you fail, you're gonna let us alone. And we said, yes. And I didn't know it. I guess most of us that were there didn't know it, but we succeed. And it says, we did not know that you could fight. We didn't know that you were this good. And from there, the Moffett Port Marines, Guam, Peru, Kenya, all parts of the Philippines, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. Never knowing that we was making history. Even when I got out, I didn't know that we was heroes. I had to read in the paper.
After their service, the Montfort Point Marines received a lot of recognition, but Luther told me about very special recognition he received.
The Marines taught me many things. Most of them was how to survive. And I heard that President was giving out Congressional Gold Medals. And I was sitting here and I looked at President giving out the medal, and I says, I'm a Montfort Marine. Maybe I should get a medal. And where Nestor Allegiant come from, I don't know, but he come into my life, and next thing I know, Sarah at the Times Herald called me and interviewed me, just like you guys are doing. And next thing I know, he announced it in church. This guy and Luther Hendricks are going back to Washington to get a Congressional Gold Medal. Frankly, I almost fainted because it was not expected. And everything was free there. They gave me 3 days of heaven. And the first thing I heard when I got there was, hoorah! And I said, who in the hell is hoorah? Well, they went from Semper Fi to hoorah. And it was 437 of us, Montfort Port Marines.
The last thing we talked about was Luther's love for the Marine Corps and how proud he was to be a Marine and how proud he is to be a Marine, but especially a Montfort Point Marine.
Everyone wants to know what happened. What is your part? How did you feel? I don't want to tell them how I felt. Did you fight? Yes. Did you kill? Yes. How many? I don't know. Did they treat you right? Treated me as good as I could expect. Did you get all the breaks you could get? I got as many breaks as I could expect. Because those times, in that year, in the 40s, 30s, 50s, we was called Negroes. They don't call us that no more. Afro-Americans, black. But whatever you call me, I'm proud. If you see 51st and 52nd, that's me. Because all I used to hear is, you people, uncle, boy, Ian, get out of the way. You're not worth nothing. If it wasn't for us, you couldn't do anything. They gave us guns. So wow, we didn't know you could fight. I didn't know it either. And it took a long time coming. But I am proud, happy. This is mine. I love it. The Marine Corps, I love it. They gave me all the orders that they could give a person. More than I expected.
It was amazing to meet and speak with Luther Hendricks. As a Marine myself, it inspired me, and I hope it inspired you as well. We hope you have enjoyed today's Veterans Voices. We are proud to honor all African Americans who have served our country. Here are some resources if you want to dig deeper. For help filing any VA claim, a County Veteran Service Officer is a great place to start. Find one near you at nacvso.org. Tuskegee Airman Inc. is dedicated to preserving the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. To learn more about these brave aviators, go to tuskegeeairmen.org. If you want to know more about the nation's first African American Marines, visit the National Munford Point Marine Association at munfordpointmarines.org. To rewatch today's episode, check back on our homepage later this week or check your cable provider's schedule for rebroadcast times. You can also rewatch this episode and many others on our YouTube channel, Veterans Voices of Contra Costa, so be sure to subscribe. Scan the QR code or follow the link to find us on all of our social media channels. Our next show will air on Wednesday, March 11th at noon. You won't want to miss it. To all of our veterans and their families, thank you for serving. To all tuned in, thanks for watching and have a great day.